All right. Wow. It looks like we already have quite a few questions. All right. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first question here for tonight is if students take classes outside of their high school, i.e. UC or community college, how do you report them to college? Do we need to go through high school or tell high school? First of all, thank you for the question. In general, these courses don't necessarily need to go into your high school transcript. In fact, the normal protocol would be to ask these institutions, i.e. a community college or UC, to send transcripts directly to the colleges that you're applying to, right? So there are going to be certain cases that you probably should inform your high school. I would say if you're applying for a community college class, typically there is a form you need to fill out because your high school guidance counselor needs to go ahead and sign a school form that basically notifies them that you are getting permission to go ahead and take classes at a local community college. For private schools, that's not really necessary. So you can inform your high school, but it's not really, a necessary step. You can go ahead and just put those courses down in the college application and then send it out. There is a slight difference between the UC application though and the Common App. For the UC app, you are supposed to put the actual institutions and the courses that you've taken and then the grade. Whereas for private schools and for most out-of-state public schools, you would just send the transcript directly to the institution. Okay, I hope that answers the question. All right, next is, does the AMY qualification still play an important role for STEM students or Asian boys? Isn't it considered as stereotypical for this particular applicant pool? Okay. Typically, my concern about like things that are a little bit stereotypical is if everything you do is more or less kind of like very similar, right? So there's no variety, there's no diversity in terms of your activities. So individually, like, it could be math club, it could be computer science, it could be things like chess. It really all depends for the colleges in terms of how well you do those, right? So individually, they're not bad activities, right? I don't want to have people have the impression that these are not worthwhile pursuits. If say math competitions or math tests are things that a student excels in, if they can do it at a very high level, it can be certainly something that could impact their application. So normally the AMY, which is the American Invitational Math Examination, is sort of like, think of it as like the next step for the AMC test, right? And if you score really high, the scale goes from 1 to 15, I believe. If you score 10 plus, you might actually qualify for the USA Math Olympiad, right? So of course, that's a much higher bar to reach, but that would certainly, at that stage, at that level, that would certainly be something that would be much more impressive for top colleges. Certain colleges definitely pay more attention to AMY scores than others. I would say like MIT actually has a place in their application to ask you for your AMY scores. Stanford mentions them. Some other schools, though, it's not necessarily part of the normal standardized tests you put in your application. In other words, on the testing section where you would normally put your SAT or ACT, there's not a place for the AMY test or your AMC scores. So what I would do is I would put that in the context of maybe some other math activities, like maybe you're part of your math club at school or you're part of a math circle, in which case I would maybe describe your AMY scores there. Okay, at worst, you could always put it in the additional information section of the common application. All right, next is, my child has been taking piano lessons since a young age. Is it considered an extracurricular activity? And if so, how do you describe it in the activity list? Yeah, it most certainly is. Now, I will say, though, that, of course, piano is probably one of the most common, if not the most common instrument that especially Asian students will play. So unless it's extraordinary, it may not necessarily make the top 10, right? Because in the Common App, you're allowed up to 10 activities. Now, if in a certain circumstance, you don't even have 10 activities, then of course, mention that you've been playing piano for a very long time. Now, of course, it also, like the Amy question earlier, it's this matter of degrees. If you're outstanding at piano to the point where, I don't know, like you're composing your own music or you are getting national level awards for playing the piano, of course, that's going to move the needle more in terms of impressing top colleges. But if you've been largely taking lessons, it's probably not going to be an impactful activity in terms of college applications, right? So it really all depends on your level of achievement and the level of excellence in that particular activity. Okay. Next is, what do you recommend to do in this summer for a rising sophomore who's interested in math? Well, if you're thinking of math as a major, of course, one of the things you could do is you could use this summer to prepare for examinations like the AMC, like we mentioned earlier in the AMY test. Of course, you can also self-study for slightly more advanced math classes. I would normally recommend math summer programs and math camps, but given that it's already June, you probably missed the window on those. So I would suggest this coming January to March, you should definitely look into, math type competitions. If you haven't already done so, you might want to inquire about local area math circles, right? So these are more like additional enrichment programs for students to get like more challenging math instruction. So those are definitely things that you would want to go ahead and kind of like emphasize. Okay. Next, if my goals are MIT and Caltech, which AP classes should I take in 11th and 12th grade years? Well, at that level, if you're looking at MIT and Caltech, you would want to take the most challenging AP classes available at your school, right? So those schools do not just cherry pick students who are only good at math and science, but without a doubt, you would want to take the most challenging math and science classes available. Obviously, if you have things like Calc BC, AP Physics C, those are things that typically the types of students who get into Caltech and MIT would want to challenge them by taking, right? Themselves by taking. Now, beyond that, though, if you can have a more well-rounded profile by taking things like AP English or AP History, that's pretty much expected for candidates who are competitive for those top schools, right? So these days, just because the applicant pool is so competitive, you probably can't get away with just taking only AP math and science classes and then regular elsewhere, just because there are going to be students who are doing that. And also at the same time challenging themselves with, harder classes across the board. So I would suggest try to challenge yourself by taking the most competitive schedule you can handle and still be able to get straight A's, hopefully. Okay. Next, do college classes or AP classes have more importance? They're both in many regards important in slightly different ways. Your typical college would want to see students challenging themselves first by taking the most rigorous classes available at your school, right? So if, let's say, for example, your school offers like AP Calc BC or AP Psychology, they would want to see you challenge yourself by taking those first. Now, if, let's say, you've taken as many APs available in your school and you want to challenge yourself by taking even additional outside classes, because for college classes, there's a wider range of subjects available, right? So that would be better, right? If you can do that. Typically, colleges don't like to see students taking outside resources that simply take the place of something they could have taken in their school, because in some ways it looks like maybe you're trying to find an easier version of that thing, right? So I would say first step is challenge yourself by taking the hardest classes at your school. Above and beyond that, if there are things that you want to take that are outside of your school, then it's fine to go ahead and supplement by taking things outside of your school. But don't consider replacing the things in your school with things outside, if that makes sense. Okay. Next is for the NASA summer research, can non-HS2 students participate? Can its grade be reported to colleges? I believe, yes, you can participate. I'm not sure if this is a graded course, though. You can certainly report it in your activities as a college to colleges as an activity, right? It should count as one of your activity slots. But I don't believe it is for college credit because it's not necessarily long enough for a typical course. Next is how many SATs do you recommend to take for college applications? That's a largely individual circumstance, but the typical student will take about 2 to 3 APs, SATs before they apply to college, right? So these days, the vast majority of colleges accept score choice, which means you could theoretically take it even 4 or 5 times and just report just your highest scores, right? But I don't necessarily recommend just taking it as often as you want to, just because at some point, it's subject to diminishing returns. Students won't necessarily push themselves as hard if they feel like they're doing it too often. So space it out, typically is what I tell students. Go ahead and plan to take it maybe twice in a given year, and then maybe one more time, the following year, and then space it out so you're adequately preparing for the next attempt, right? Not just necessarily taking it every single available test date, okay? But ultimately it depends on how well you can do the first couple of times. So if you've taken it once or twice and you feel like there's still room to be able to get a higher score, then you're more than welcome to go ahead and take it another time to try to see if you can get that higher score. Okay. Next is how will grade 11, I'm assuming rising grade 11, prepare for biochemistry Olympiad in this fall? I mean, there are a couple of ways. You could probably go ahead and just self-study whatever textbooks are recommended for bio or chem Olympiads. There are some prep courses that you can take, or there's some institutions that have, courses specifically to prepare for that. That's probably what I would look into. But I would say, at this point, if you're a rising 11th grader, hopefully you've already taken bio and chem. I would look online to try to see previously released exams first to try to see what your weaknesses are before you decide to, invest in a course or something like that, or get a tutor or coach for that. Okay. Next is if a student likes biochem, whether it be good volunteers or volunteering in this field that will help students go to an Ivy League college? Probably not, to be honest. Like biochemistry is a very specific thing. And when you're looking at volunteering, you don't necessarily need to have your volunteering line up with your major, right? Biochemistry is very, very specific, right? I don't think there are going to be many institutions that would give access to students as a volunteer, but you can do internships for biochemistry to be sure, right? So typically they're fairly competitive research programs for biochemistry where you can work under a professor as an intern. Maybe that's what you're referring to as opposed to volunteering. And if so, there are programs that every single summer they're very competitive summer research programs that you can try for. And I think that's probably your best bet to impress Ivy League colleges, right? So for your volunteering though, it doesn't have to be related to your major. Like I said, just find things that you're actually genuinely passionate about. Okay. All right, next is, would you recommend self-studying and taking AP tests for subjects which are not offered at a high school? Generally, no, I'm not a big fan of that, simply because taking the test itself doesn't really mean that much to colleges, right? The test itself is, sure, maybe it might get you some credits, but it's more impressive to colleges that you've actually taken the actual coursework, because in the grand scheme of things, the transcripts and the grades are far more impactful than the actual AP tests themselves. So sure, I mean, it's mildly more impressive to have an extra score or two, but with the same amount of time you would invest to kind of getting those scores, you may as well have taken like a college level class, because it shows more love of learning, which is one of these things that colleges want to see, rather than you just being good at taking more paper exams. Okay. Okay, so we got a couple more questions. I'll probably just cap it at these last two. Next, is it a good idea to put only took SAT one time on a resume? Well, given that you can use score choice, it's probably not all. I mean, for a resume, probably your high score, sure, right? But for college applications, because they have use score choice, yeah, once or twice. Colleges know that students will take it, probably multiple times anyway. For the purposes of the resume, though, I think your high score is more than sufficient, right? So I would say, for the purposes of like if you're applying for an internship or something like that, high score is enough. There's no need to give your prior history, especially if the scores are substantially lower. Okay. Next is, how important is AP European history compared to AP World History and AP US History? I'm not sure important is the right word, just because AP European history is not necessarily as commonly available for many high schools. It's probably viewed as an optional kind of like elective type of history. I mean, it's certainly important in the sense that it's an AP and it would still look pretty rigorous, of course, right? So if you can take that, because most students will probably take World and US, not every high school will have it. So taking it, especially if you're thinking of a social science major, would look pretty impressive, to be honest, right? So in that sense, it's important, right? But I would imagine the colleges would view them all equally well. I mean, they're fairly similar in terms of rigor. I would say AP US History is probably deemed, I would say, harder than AP World in my experience. AP Euro is probably comparable in terms of, just the overall rigor itself. So I think in that regard, it's still going to be viewed as a pretty impressive test if you can do that, okay? Because once again, it shows that you're going above and beyond your school curriculum if you take it anyway, okay? All right, yeah, so some great questions. Hopefully that helped you understand and there are a lot of questions dealing with testing as well. So I think that's probably because it's summer, right? So that should give you a lot of understanding of how to maybe prepare for these upcoming tests. Okay. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. And I will see you all again next week. Take care.